Thank you so much, Chris. I'd like to say, just to reiterate, first of all, congratulations to the Bankinter Foundation on its 10th anniversary. It's a stunning achievement, and as a beneficiary of all of the things that go on at the Foundation, I wanted to thank you personally for everything you've done. It's a great success, and I think the world's taking note. So it's a short time to have accomplished so much, so congratulations. I'd also like to say that, as Chris said, when he mentioned that they were thinking, the organizers were thinking about what to talk about, the first topic they discussed was financial flows, and they decided it wasn't ambitious enough. So that's what I'm talking about, the piece that's not ambitious enough to be a subject in and of itself. Also, I just want to talk about this one slide. I could talk about this slide all day because I think it's one of the most fundamental and important shifts that the world has seen over the last 50, maybe even 100 years. And it's all since 2008. I look at the last period from 2008 and the big Great Recession. I kind of think of that in my mind as a rich man's depression. And I say that because depressions, as terrible as they are, seem to clean the house out. They change the balance sheets. Ultimately, they shift in terms of, in many cases, distribution of wealth. They get rid of debt. They transfer it sometimes from private to public balance sheets. There's a lot of house cleaning that goes on during a depression in the aftermath so that you can have a rebuilding period. And I think we've gone through that in a way that we should acknowledge is almost as fundamental as in the 1930s, but we went through it from a standpoint of wealth at least 30 times greater than we had in the 1930s. So we didn't feel it as acutely. Now the world is exiting that period. It's doing it in slower paces in certain parts of the world, faster paces other parts of the world. Some parts of the world are out of that period, some are still in. But since 2008, under the radar, what has happened, now this is particular for the United States. If you see that chart, you see that since 2008, the amount of energy produced in the United States, in terms of oil and natural gas, has skyrocketed. We've seen tremendous increase. This is all due to a new technology, fairly new technology, that was perfected in 2006-07 by one small oil and gas company, the Mitchell Energy Company, which was able to perfect this process of fracking. Now, there's a lot of concern about fracking, whether or not it's environmentally safe and so forth. There are questions still to be resolved. But one thing we do know for sure is that this has transformed the energy landscape in a profound way for an extremely long period of time. And that this transition will only grow greater because fracking is still in its infancy, and there are technologies that will triple yields from fracking technology, only increasing the benefit. Now, the primary beneficiary first is the United States in terms of the quickness and speed with which it has been able to employ this technology to start developing its natural resources. Part of that has to do with the fact that the United States is one of the only, if not the only, country in the world where oil and gas can be owned by individuals and not the state. So you have a lot of activity and entrepreneurship in this particular sector. So if you look at the amount of natural gas per day being produced, you see this is a tremendous increase. Now, to match this, we have just had the release by one of the largest engine manufacturers in the world, Cummins Engine, of the first long-haul trucking natural gas engine. So we're starting to see the infrastructure put in place for a shift from oil, diesel fuel for long distance travel in the United States to natural gas. That means a shift from internationally traded commodity to a domestically produced commodity, and with it, ultimately, trillions of dollars worth of changes in terms of the flow of capital around the world. This is very good news for the United States, probably very bad news for OPEC in terms of the way OPEC is structured and that trend that OPEC has seen over the last decade and a half of a concentration of production of fuel and consequently the movement of capital into OPEC's treasuries. That will change as the United States, essentially the largest consumer or number one or number two, depending on where China is, the number one or number two consumer of OPEC products essentially leaves that market and ultimately begins exporting. So if you look at a little snapshot here of what we're seeing, I tried to put as much on this slide as I could because Chris restricted my use of PowerPoints. So I'm on, speaking of Eastern Germany, I'm on a PowerPoint restriction diet. So here we have on one slide something that I think shows exactly what happened. 2008, oil hits $145 a barrel. The U.S. is on track to export $1 trillion that year to pay for that oil, given the amount of oil that was used at that time in the economy, the amount of the price of oil and so forth. That's a huge sum of money to leave the United States, mostly for the OPEC countries, Venezuela, Nigeria, and so forth, a little to Saudi Arabia. So that really caused a shift, entirely private sector driven in the United States, toward fracking technology in a very quick period. This was not a government initiative. That's what's remarkable about this change. There was no government hand in this particular change. You see then the trend at the bottom, which is in this year, 2013, the U.S. will import $400 billion worth of oil. And in 2020, as far as the projections are, the U.S. will export zero. So that's a $400 billion shift in capital flows, and eventually that will go positive in terms of U.S. exporting energy as well. And we'll have, in some ways, a repeat in terms of the league tables of energy exporters that we had in the 1920s with the United States, particularly at the time Texas, as the largest producer of energy in the world. So we're seeing a very profound shift. This will affect capital flows, investment flows, and so forth. So at the same time that we have this shift, we have prices for this commodity in the U.S. being essentially going down as we have this abundance. Now this is important because one of the interesting aspects of this transition, which is a technological revolution having an economic and capital repercussion, is that rig counts, as they call them, which are essentially the equipment in the ground that extracts the resource, have gone from 1,400 rigs producing natural gas in 2011 to 400 rigs this year. So we have had a huge decline in the number of rigs working in the fields with no decline in output. So this technology is getting better and better, and it's on a very fast learning curve. As a result, U.S. energy prices in general are far, far below the rest of the world. So I bring this up not so much because of the energy implications, but because we're talking about cash flows. capital flows and where that capital is likely to go. So there's going to be a reorganization of capital flows. Now, I was talking to some people at Xenon Capital, a big international private equity fund that is specialized in the area of pipelines, particularly in Eastern Europe. They've been involved in investing in some of the pipelines that bring energy from Russia into Germany and other parts of Europe. And what they're starting to see is an interest in Europe in getting off to a large extent, as much as possible, the reliance upon Russia and in particular for natural gas, and perhaps moving toward an import relationship with the U.S. to at least, if not replace Russian gas, have a second supplier, which would give them some leverage. And it makes perfect sense that this would happen, and that from a business and geopolitical perspective, it makes a lot of sense. The second trend that is accompanying this trend right here is a movement back to the United States manufacturing capabilities. So I have a list. It was too long for my slides, although I would have loved to have put it in my stack of slides. A list of 85 projects, manufacturing projects in the United States that are worth a total of $65 billion, that are examples of manufacturing projects that would have gone elsewhere in the world but are coming back to the U.S. because of oil and natural gas prices. Now, think about this in terms of capital flows. We start seeing the United States again as an energy exporter. We see the trade balance in the U.S., if not going positive in the middle term future, at least going neutral because of this lack of $400 billion imports of fuel. And we see more concentration and investment in the U.S. of manufacturing. So that can be a tremendous shift that is in the process of taking place, whether it happens full-blown or whether it happens in pieces. It's hard to tell, but it's happening right now. And in fact, it's happening, as I say again, on its own, without planning and without much supervision, I might say. So this is a big shift with tremendous implications for where capital will be accumulated going forward and how that capital is likely to be spent. So that's just one of the big trends that we're looking at. And I think it's one of essentially a handful of big shifts that the world is undergoing as we work our way out of this rich man's depression and into the new world that's coming. And one of the, as I say, one of the interesting facts is that as we get out and the balance sheets are clean or cleaner, particularly the private sector balance sheets, household income balance sheets and household wealth balance and so forth, all of these fundamental and very important shifts, we're going to start to see a new world emerging. Now, the emerging market countries are continuing to rise and should continue, but the question is at what pace? And this is particularly clear when you look at the fact that we've had so far a three-speed economic recovery with U.S. in the middle, Europe, Eurozone really struggling to come out of the depths of the downturn, and the high point of emerging market growth having been hit and now slowing down a bit. The question is, of course, how long will the slowdown in emerging markets last? So if you look at the holdings of foreign reserves, this is another shift that's happening. There's well more than $1 trillion, almost $2 trillion in foreign reserves that emerging market countries are in possession of. And this gives them an enormous amount of flexibility, enormous amount of ability to influence events, and also to invest, whether it's in U.S. manufacturing growth, whether it's in their own domestic economies and so forth. But we have to keep in mind in many cases, and I'll mention something about the sovereign wealth funds, that most of this money, this tremendous amount of capital in emerging market countries is not going to be invested in their own countries. And the reason is that they simply don't have the capacity yet to absorb that capital, this $2 trillion worth of capital, without causing massive inflation. So they're very reluctant to invest domestically, and much more interested then as a result in investing globally and in being smart about that investment, because emerging market countries have really watched a century of investment having gone wrong by their forebearers, whether it was Japan or other countries, having made investments that were too short-term or too much at the height of the market. So we're seeing a very sophisticated movement of this emerging market capital. Now, these reserves are really, when you look at them, China really is just phenomenal in terms of the amount of reserves it has built up. $3.4 trillion. This is probably small in terms of the current statistics. This is only as of April, but these figures grow relatively rapidly. And if you look, the only outlier in this is Japan, which has created a very significant stockpile of foreign reserves as well. The rest of this concentration of wealth is in emerging market countries. And as you can see, I actually was low in my addition in the previous slide. We're really talking about $5 or $6 trillion of foreign reserves. So the other point, and let me go back just to say how much. You know, economics used to be called political economy, and it was called that for a reason, because economic decisions are pristine and pure, but of course there's always the political dimension that influences that purity and turns it into real-world brawling. And right now, it was that China was the largest purchaser of U.S. debt in the world, and that's now changed. China is still a very large purchaser of U.S. debt, but the largest is now Japan. And if you look at what's going on in the conflict between China and Japan, you see that Japan is rushing in to buy U.S. debt in a gesture of friendship, one could say, or influence, but it's also a reminder of who your friends are. So we see that both China and Japan could be in competition to purchase this debt in order to win the influence of the United States, which is completely opposite in some ways the way people describe how that debt is out there as a albatross around the United States' neck that is something that, in fact, the United States has to feel manipulated by, it has to be very careful of, because its creditors could shut it off at any moment. In fact, countries want that debt. They're rushing in because they see it as a way to influence the United States, and so it's very likely they'll continue to buy it, and those interest rates will stay low. But in the meantime, we're looking at big changes. In terms of attractiveness, here's another index to focus on. China has seen a big drop in terms of its attractiveness for foreign investment. The U.S. is increasing UK is very strong, particularly now, and Germany and Europe, people are going for the safe bets, and they're trying to buy low in the hopes that when there is a strong recovery, they'll be in the right place. So this has led to a kind of interesting mix in terms of how we have come out of the rich man's depression. And first of all, you have to see that the balance sheets of the central banks have taken on the household and the private sector debt in many instances and to a very large extent in order to do what is always done during a depression, which is move the debt from one sector which can't pay to another sector that can't be made to pay. So you have central banks taking on that debt, and they're doing it in a way where the only option really is to grow out of the debt. This is never going to be repaid. The United States has never really repaid any of its debt from World War II. It's simply grown so that debt is less a percentage of GDP. And I remember when I was in college, my credit card bill of $1,000 was terrifying. But you know, I've grown out of that, and I can afford now to have more than $1,000 on my credit cards. And I think that's the way countries realistically look at things like debt. Nobody really ever repays it. So the treasuries, as I mentioned, Japan is now the biggest purchaser of treasuries. These auctions are still going flawlessly. We see little jumps and shifts in interest rates, but effectively interest rates are low and going to stay low for the foreseeable future. I think Ben Bernanke and his colleagues in the US have done an excellent job. We're seeing a kind of waking up in Europe to the fact that austerity may not be the best course forward, since it penalizes everybody and doesn't take advantage of the ability of countries to essentially weasel their way out of paying back what they owe. So another interesting sector that has been getting a lot of attention has been private equity. There's probably around $4 to $5 trillion in private equity at this point. It's difficult to calculate it because it's global, it's accounted for differently. There's a lot of debt inside the equity as well. But there's probably about $4 to $5 trillion in private equity. This is money that's highly concentrated in a few dozen firms. So when we talk about the new forms of capital, hedge funds as well, what we're seeing is that this is a big concentration of wealth and capital in a relatively small group of firms, primarily located in either New York or London. So this group, through debt and through leveraging of their capital, it has really taken control of many firms, some of which are now fully privately owned, some of which are partially private owned, partially public, but worth trillions and trillions of dollars and employing millions and millions of people around the world. This sector has been hit most hard during the downturn after 2008. But there are some indications that fundraising for private equity are increasing, and the sector is going to be picking up. The returns and a lot of money was lost in 2008. But what has happened that's interesting is that while there were losses, because this is such a concentrated sector, companies, private equity firms were able to trade their investments that did not work out between each other, sell them, create secondary markets for the ownership of stakes in companies that they took over. And rather than seeing a collapse, they were able to create for themselves a soft landing. And now they're in a position, as the capital markets around the world come back, to start selling these properties once again. So this is very interesting, and here we have a picture of the other major force. There's one more that my slide was removed, but I will get to. And this is sovereign wealth funds. And suffice it to say, this sector has $12 trillion, about $12 trillion worth of capital accumulated. Most of that is concentrated in the Middle Eastern countries. Abu Dhabi alone has over $1 trillion in various types of funds, Mubadala, and so forth. That money is being, again, very strategically used. It's not used domestically because of the fear of inflation. It's invested globally. There are limited options, however. The degrees of freedom that sovereign wealth funds have is limited by the fact that they have so much capital they can easily create inflationary situations. Certainly they can drive up prices on their own, and they have to be very judicious about their buying, and they are very sophisticated in terms of the management, with essentially the best minds in the world in finance working in these firms. The last point I'll make is about hedge funds. Now, hedge funds have $2 trillion or so worth of capital, which they are investing, often at high degrees of leverage. So that capital is expanded well beyond that $2 trillion mark. But they account for approximately 1% of the financial resources, investable resources that firms have. Now, that again is like private equity in the sense that this is a highly concentrated group of firms, again, principally in New York and the New York area, and also in London, and they account for 1%. So 1% is not that large, but when you say that 20 firms control 1% of financial investing in the hedge fund market, and 20 firms or so in the private equity world control 2% of the world's financial resources, investable resources. We're talking about a change after the meltdown of 2008 of high concentration, much greater concentration of wealth in these new firms, much more concentration going forward of wealth in the United States, given natural gas, and a world that in fact is going to be different because of the way capital is allocated and controlled. And the final thought I just want to say is that after the rich man's depression, the worst mistake we can make is to think that the world is going to be aligned the same as it was before we had that catastrophe. I think we'll see different alignment. I think we'll see different forms of capital, new innovations, and I think we'll see different flows of capital around the world. Thank you very much.
Super.